This is SoundLives, a NewMusicBox podcast sharing insights and stories from people who dedicate their lives to new music. Brought to you by New Music USA, the resource for adventurous creators and listeners in the US and beyond.
Welcome to SoundLives. I'm Frank J. Oteri, and you're listening to Anthony Davis's Little Richard's New Wave from his score from Melissa Fenley's ballet Hemispheres, performed by Davis's group Episteme. My guest is Anthony Davis, whom I spoke with in between rehearsals for his opera X, which is being performed in May by the Detroit Opera. We spoke about the worlds of jazz and opera and how for him they're not all that far apart, as well as the urgency for artists to challenge the status quo. You've worked in so many different kinds of musical idioms over the last half century, so it's hard to zero in on things, but of course, with getting the Pulitzer for Central Park 5, everybody's paying attention to the operas. For a long time, everybody paid attention to the small jazz combo stuff that you do, and you sort of existed in these two worlds, which to an outsider who doesn't necessarily understand music might seem like they're polar opposites.
Never occurred to me that they were opposites at all. I mean, I felt that one informs the other. For example, yesterday I was working with improvisers in X. We had a rehearsal with the improvisers 2 days ago. I still try to bring that spontaneity and the musicality of the improviser's mind to what I'm doing in the opera too.
But of course, improvisation in opera, aside from your operas and maybe a handful of other people, who mind this terrain, is not something you would normally associate with opera. It's like nobody's improvising in Puccini.
Yeah, but they might do in Baroque.
yeah, of course. Well, that's the thing is I was thinking about these relationships. I thought, well, both small combo jazz and opera really are at their best when it's a symbiotic collaboration between the various participants. And also, while both are group efforts, they offer opportunities for individuals to shine.
Right, exactly. And it's been wonderful for me working with these new singers that I've been working with here in Detroit and see them make their part theirs. And that's always a process of, and sometimes particularly in the role of Street, that I created, which was so identified with Thomas Young, who's a wonderful, incredible singer. Victor Ryan Robertson is doing it now. He's making it his, so he's doing different things. So he would come up to me and say, well, that's not exactly what's on the page. And I say, well, that's okay. Because it's also making it his. I like the fact that, and particularly in that role, that every performer can kind of make it reflect them and bring their own personality to it, because the personality is so important. Sometimes I think about Cab Calloway and performers like that who were bigger than life, and whatever they did was Cab Calloway, but still it invested, bringing Cab Calloway into a role or into something it reflects a whole tradition and a whole musical history.
And of course, with a part like you mentioned, the role of Street, which is a double part because that singer is Street and also Elijah Muhammad.
Elijah Muhammad, yeah.
Two very different characters.
Yeah, they're parallels. They're both hustlers in different ways, So what people miss is that sometimes their message has similarities too. But what I wanted to bring to Elijah is, is then when you sing Elijah, it's more line and it's different quality. But I think that's a great challenge for a performer to transform themselves, transform their vocal approach too.
Now, this whole thing about getting interested in opera, I want to take this back to the beginning. You began your life immersed in classical music before you ever got involved with jazz, as far as I know.
Right, that's true. I was a classical pianist. I took piano lessons, and then I was very serious about it. But I always had jazz, and we always had jazz in our house. My father was a huge Art Tatum fan, and he also had Dave Brubeck records when they came out, and then had a Charles Mingus record, Blues and Roots record. I remember I really got into that when I grew up. As you can hear in X, because some of the harmonic progressions are right from Monin, from that. So I grew up hearing that too. My dad would love Kurt Weill, so I heard Three Penny Opera was probably the opera I heard the most before. And then my grandfather was an opera fan. I didn't see them that much. They lived in Hampton. He was the treasurer of Hampton Institute with the historically black university in Hampton, Virginia. He initiated an opera series to bring black opera performers to perform at Hampton. So when I meet older opera singers like, Betty Allen or people I met a number of years ago, and or Leontine Price, they all performed at my grandfather's series. I would hear, Verdi and Puccini when I would go to his house. But then he also loved organ trios and gospel music. That's what I associate with him. So I had a little bit of contact with that, but mostly I was immersed in classical stuff, playing Chopin, Beethoven, Mozart, all that stuff.
Were you writing any music at that time?
I wrote music when I was little, like second grade, first grade. I was living in Princeton, New Jersey, and they had a music school called Nassau Street Music School. It was really interesting because you had 2 lessons a week. So you had one lesson, regular one-on-one lesson. Then you had a group lesson with a cardboard keyboard, and you have to sing. You'd have to sing all the parts, which is great because I could practice on a desk at school and study hall or wherever. I could imagine the keyboard, hear the music in my head, and just do it. Also, part of it, we had to do a recital every month. Part of the recital, you had to do one of your own pieces. I wrote pirate songs and stuff like that, because I was in second grade. But then when I moved to State College, Pennsylvania, that kind of stopped it. It was just traditional classical piano I was doing.
There's a story I love that I've heard you tell, that at one point you were going to Italy with your family, and a friend, as a joke, gave your father a copy of Monk in Italy, and that's what brought Thelonious Monk into your life forever.
Exactly. I love that record. I wore out that record. I listened to it over and over. I think what got me was that it was 1966, and I was, middle of the civil rights thing, and I had this kind of crisis going to Italy. I started thinking about what it meant to be a black person. Because where I grew up in State College was, my brother and I were the only black people in the school. I began to think about that, and I began to resent the fact that I was playing all white composers, and that really upset me. Discovering Monk, I was really interested because it would seem a seamless transition from his role as an improviser and as a composer. It seemed to be one voice. And when I heard him play and when I heard his compositions, it seemed to be a common aesthetic. And that's really what drew me to his music. Initially, we didn't have a piano, and I had to go to the Steinway store in Torino, Italy, to practice. At first, I was playing Beethoven and stuff, and I was playing a lot of Schumann then. So I was playing that Fantasy Stück stuff. One day, because I've been listening to this Monk stuff, so I started picking out Straight No Chaser, and then Ruby My Dear, and I started playing Monk tunes in the Steinway store, and they liked it. They liked that I was playing Monk tunes, and so by the end of the time, I actually did a couple concerts in Italy where I played half program of classical piano and then half program of doing Monk tunes, and then I started doing my own compositions. That's when I first started writing for pieces that I could improvise around.
Wow, so it really was Thelonious Monk. That fortuitous joke gift turned into this life-changing. I love when things like that happen.
Well, and also they had this great record store in Torino where they had this conveyor belt which would bring the record, right? And you could listen to like 3 or 4 records before you bought one. So I would listen to all these Coltrane records because I heard Coltrane with Monk, and I heard Miles, Miles records, and then Sonny Rollins. But then I started listening to Bud Powell and started expanding, like just every day going to this record store and listening to some records before I went home.
But in terms of like a lifelong influence, even to the point, when you made your first album, when you made Past Lives, there's a lot of Monk on there, and you have a very, very personal, idiomatic version of Monk that you do. That's wonderful on that record. Let's listen to Anthony Davis play Thelonious Monk's composition Evidence from Davis's 1978 debut recording, Past Lives, on Red Records.
Listening to Monk really opened my mind to music and to what I could become as a composer and also as a player, as an improviser. And I started changing my technique. I'm playing with flat fingers and stuff. I said, my normal classical technique that doesn't sound right to me. So I did a lot of things like emulating Monk and learning Monk from studying his music, and then meeting someone like Steve Lacy, who was so immersed in Monk too. I mean, he was immersed in Monk, and I didn't have the chance to play with Monk. I had the chance to hear Monk live one time. It was supposed to be a Monk tribute concert at Carnegie Hall, and Monk was in the audience, and he just stood up and walked on stage and played the whole concert.
Wow.
And that was unbelievable. I think Barry Harris was supposed to play, but Monk played the whole concert.
Oh, that's fantastic. So all of this kind of transformation, it's like classical pianist, discovers Monk, does all this stuff. But then you went off to Yale. Were you studying composition at Yale? What were you?
Initially, I was a philosophy major. I studied philosophy, and that interest started in Italy too. I had a wonderful teacher who started a philosophy class when I was in 10th grade in Italy. It was basically existentialism 101, He read Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and, Sartre and Camus and all that stuff, but which is a dangerous thing for a 10th grader, I think, But I could have turned into a nihilist pretty easily, but anyway.
There's this guy who read Nausea as an undergrad. He dropped out of school as a result.
Well, that's what I was about to do. By the time I got to Yale, I was still like, oh, grades, who cares? We're all going to die. But Nietzsche opened my mind to opera. It was through Birth of Tragedy and reading that I became interested in the idea of opera and what opera could be. But I thought that what Nietzsche was writing about in terms of the Apollonian and Dionysian and kind of binary that he created was more applicable to American music than it was to German, because of that we're African and we're Europeans. The combination of the musical foundation in two great cultures. So I thought opera could have that. An American opera ideally would be that kind of expression.
Before we jump to opera, I want to get one last thing before you started doing that. The early work you were doing and working with people like Marion Brown and Anthony Braxton and Wadada Leo Smith, who you've continued playing with for years, I sort of think of that. It's like, okay, you might have gone to Yale and gotten a music degree. I didn't know that you were a philosophy major, but I thought...
I did eventually get a music degree. I couldn't write my thesis on Hegel. I decided to be a music major my senior year. So I had to go take all the required courses, which was funny.
But I thought, working with those people was probably better, and you learn more than anybody you would have learned from at Yale.
Yeah. Well, I did have one teacher at Yale, Robert Morris, who was a great theorist, and he had a composition class, so I took his composition class. I met Wadada my freshman year at Yale. It was interesting because, he was playing duos at a duo with Marion Brown, and he was living in New Haven. So eventually, George Lewis and I, who were both freshmen at Yale at the same time, got together with Wadada to play as a trio. We were playing Wadada's music, which was great because for me it was an introduction to that whole world. That through Wadada I met Braxton, and I met so many other musicians. The other connection I had was I took classes at Wesleyan in South Indian music. And through Jay Hogarth and other people, I met Ed Blackwell, who was teaching at Middletown, and Marion Brown was also in Wesleyan at the time. And so I started playing with Blackwell and Mark Elias. We had a trio, and then with Jay Hogarth, a vibraphonist. So that was great because, through Blackwell, I got to meet Ornette and go to New York, go down to Prince Street to play pool with Ornette.
Oh, wow. Oh, that must have been.
That was really fun. And Ornette was so great. I think that time Blackwell was giving DiNardo drum lessons. So I would go down with Blackwell, take him down to the city, and then hang out with Ornette during the drum lesson. It was great to get to know him. And I always loved his music, too.
So encountering those people, how much of their ideas seeped into your composition ideas, if any? Because your music seems to be, for lack of a better term, very heterodox in that it embraces so many things open-endedly and uses them for what they can be used for. It's a means to an end, but never an end in and of itself.
Right. Well, I think there were tremendous influence. I mean, Wadada particularly was a huge influence on me because I got together with Wadada regularly. And some of it was just listening. When I first met Wadada, I was really immersed in Monk and Bud Powell. I was really a bebop piano player. I was really more that was coming from that, and Herbie Hancock and McCoy Tyner. McCoy Tyner was a big influence on me too. And then when Dada, I started listening more to Ellington, older music, James P. Johnson, Fats Waller, stride pianists. Because he came up to me one day and I was playing with my trio and he said, "What happened to your left hand?" I was playing bebop with chords and left. And he said, "Don't you improvise with your left hand?" And I said, so I took that as the thing. So I did a solo on my left hand, what the hell? I began to really also develop my own musical language. Also listening to Cecil Taylor a lot. Cecil was a big influence. And then later when I moved to New York, I got to know Cecil really well. And he was someone who was a real mentor for me as well. But then developing different kind of hand independence, so I could play. And then I used to imagine we'd go with Ornette and playing with Blackwell and Ornette. I was thinking of how I could be Charlie Hayden in left hand and Don Cherry in the right. I wanted to see how I could do that. But I started playing with two lines at once, and that helped me a lot because when I played with Leroy Jenkins, I was in a lot of groups without bass player. We had a group with Leroy, Andrew Cyril, and me with violin, drums, and piano. So I had to take on a lot of the other functions. That was a challenge and interesting for me, and way to develop different aspects of my piano playing, and also fed into my overall aesthetic. But I think with Wadada, and then being introduced to Ellington suites and studying Ellington's music, I began to think about long form, about creating long form compositions. I was really into Mingus too, so I studied a lot of Mingus's music. I started thinking about how to create longer form, so I wrote science fiction suites that were based on science fiction novels. And my band at that time was George Lewis and Hal Lewis and Wes Brown and Jerry Hemingway. So we had a really, really, really great group.
Is the group that led to Epistemy, or is it?
It was before. It was called Advent at the time. So it was named after the speakers. George came up with the name. So George and I had the group together, and we did some of George's music too. So we also did some of Henry's music and Muhal's music. George brought in a lot of music from AACM. So for a college group in the 70s, we were pretty out there, and then doing our own music. So I wrote a series with the Left-Handed Darkness suite. I wrote Dune suite. And then I wrote a piece called Madagascar. That was because I found out my ancestors came from Madagascar, which was weird, for a black person in America to be from the East Africa, have roots in East Africa. I wrote a lot of large-scale pieces for the group. So I began to develop my own voice and what kind of music I was going to do. And also then playing with Wadada, with that New Delta Acri, with Wes Brown, initially just with Wes and Wadada and me, and then later with Ferrone and Oliver Lake.
So I never knew about the whole Madagascar thing with you. Does that explain your deep interest in Indonesian music because of the relationship between Madagascar and Indonesia?
Well, not really. I mean, but it just came from music from Wesleyan because they have a gamelan. And I went to a Wayang performance in Middletown. That wiped me out. I was so excited about it. I started writing a series of pieces called Wayangs. Initially solo piano, and then for my group. And then Wayang 5 was for orchestra and piano, and then I did a 2-piano thing with Ursula Oppens I wrote. I was really captivated by the music and also the drama of it. I began to think about what it means to create a rhythmic drama, a rhythm drama. And that influenced my approach to opera too, as well.
Let's listen to a bit of Anthony Davis's Wayang 5, performed by the Boston Modern Orchestra Project, conducted by Gil Rose, with Anthony Davis as the piano soloist, released on BMOP Sound. that's actually a good point to transition to talking about opera, because as I was saying before, this whole idea of you're using different sound worlds as means to an end. I would almost say, if you would allow the metaphor here, to use the music to do what it needs to do by any means necessary to tell a story, which
Yeah.
brings us to
Little
Malcolm X.
Malcolm quote. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because all these different musics create a different atmosphere. They can really delineate a drama, describe, places, etc. And I found this really interesting for me to explore the intersection. Also because opera is so much about memory. You always go back to things that are in the opera. You're creating your own kind of world in it, but also has the extra world of what it refers to in terms of opera, the whole genre of opera, and also what other music you bring into opera. What I draw on in terms of influences in the opera is part of the creation of the world that I want to create in an opera. My second opera, for example, was all Wayang's music. It was controversial because it was all influenced by the Indonesian influence and the Wayang music I'd been developing. And I wanted to write it in contrast to X, which was much more expansive. And it's always fun for me to discover what the language of the opera will be and how it reflects the story and the narrative.
I get the science fiction thing because you were reading science fiction novels. You were inspired by Ursula Le Guin, so you're inspired to do the second opera, Under the Double Moon, which is a science fiction opera. But what led you to decide that Malcolm X was a great narrative for an opera?
It started with my brother Christopher. My brother Kip was an actor, and he was in a play called El Haj Malik, playing the role of Malcolm X in the play. So I went to the play, and after the show, he came up to me and he said, you should write a musical about Malcolm X, because in the autobiography, there's so many references to music. I mean, he was around musicians and music, particularly, the jazz music. He was there all the time. All the musicians I know from that, who knew him in that period, because he was around the music. Even Billy Taylor told me the story that when he had a radio show on WBAI, that he had a jazz show, that literally Malcolm gave his sermon on Sunday just before the jazz show. So he would always stay for the music. So I had this image of Malcolm listening to John Coltrane's quartet, or Sonny Rollins or something, So I felt that the link to the music was really evident. So my brother's initial concept that he talked to me was the idea of the parallel of the development of the politics and Malcolm's odyssey as becoming a political figure with the evolution of the music. So you could start, in the late 30s and 40s in musical style, into the bebop period in the late 40s, early 50s, into modal period and the avant-garde. Some of that is actually in the opera. That's what the inspiration for Scene 2 and Act 1, Scene 2, when you're in Boston, I'm sort of creating this thing of, all of a sudden he's being introduced to the city, and he's really being introduced to the music. Because in the autobiography, it talks about hearing Lionel Hampton's orchestra in Boston. So the bass player in Lionel Hampton's orchestra in the early 50s was Mingus.
Right.
And Mingus wrote Mingus Fingus for Lionel Hampton's orchestra. And I love Mingus anyway, so I thought I have to do something about that in relation to Mingus. Makes sense. And then I wrote the Ella's aria. I borrowed from the Left Hand of Darkness suite. The first part was actually called The Left Hand of Darkness originally. So I wrote a melody on top of what was Left Hand of Darkness, and actually had the alto and trombone melodies come in between. So it worked very well in coming with Bella's welcoming Malcolm to her home in Boston. And then it changes, all of a sudden it modulates. It's very kind of Ellington chords that take you into F minor, which is like Mingus's F minor D flat. It's like his Pithecanthropus erectus, Moanin. I could just think 10 million pieces like that of Mingus's. But I realized that the progression later, actually didn't know until later, that progression kind of comes from the tune You Don't Know What Love Is. But it was interesting to me because in a sense, it's like the title of that song is the underscoring for the scene. You don't know what love is until you've heard the meaning of the blues. He didn't understand the meaning of the blues yet. And that he's going to learn from Street about the blues, because all of Street's music is really rooted in the blues. So the conversion he has from Malcolm Little to Detroit Red is through the blues. Think about the blues as subversive, and the blues is subverting middle class aspirations, and in a way that it was a reflection of what Street would call the hopelessness of the middle class aspirations, as being a response to that, a subversive response to it, rather than a different kind of subversive response with the Nation of Islam or something. So the only option he has is the hustler's life.
Now, interesting that you're saying all this, because as I was listening yet again to X last night, to that wonderful recording, which is sadly out of print, hopefully someone will reissue that. Well, hopefully there'll be new recordings as well.
Yeah, we're doing a new one in June.
Oh, fantastic. That's great. But I'm listening to this and I'm thinking to myself, I'm listening to that section with Street. And one of the things I'm hearing in Street's phrasing, I don't know if it's me or if I'm crazy, but I'm like, this is so interesting because it's not operatic phrasing. It's not like bel canto phrasing or verismo phrasing. It's Abby Lincoln's phrasing. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
oh yeah.
wow, I'm hearing, the way she phrased things there.
Because Thomas is a great jazz singer.
Yeah. Let's listen to Thomas Young as Street and the pool hall scene in Act 1, Scene 2 from the original recording of the opera X. Music by Anthony Davis, libretto by Thulani Davis, released on Gramavision.
Shoot your shot, cut the talk, admit your 2 bits are mine. You'll be owing me next week's pay before you get out from behind. Hey there! Take a look, it's a country boy. Up from the farm. I once had that look before, but now when their work is done, they all come to me.
That was a revelation to me because when I originally wrote the opera, Street was a bass. Because I wanted to get as far away from sport and life as I could because people might relate it to sport and life. Actually, Avery Brooks was the first Street.
That's right.
Then when we did it, Avery wanted to play Malcolm. So I said, of course, it'd be great. Because he's an incredible actor and incredible musician, too. When I was doing auditions for Elijah Muhammad, and Thomas came in and sang the Daughter of the Regiment aria, of All the High Seas, and killed it. And then he sang Gounod's Faust, and he killed that. So I said, well, you're Elijah Muhammad. That's not any question. And then he said, well, I'm singing. I was living in Manhattan Plaza at the time. So he was singing in a club in my building that night. He was singing at the West Bank Cafe, which is a club on right on 42nd Street. So I called my brother up. We went down to hear him sing, and hear this incredible jazz singer who could scat like Ella, who could do all this, and plus, he was doing Strayhorn tunes and killing Strayhorn tunes in Ellington and the hippest stuff. And so I said to Kip, I think I have to make Street a tenor too. We have to make Street and Elijah this played by the same person. I mean, it'll make sense because
wow.
Yeah. So I say he can be an antagonist throughout the opera too. And there are a lot of benefits to that. So we talked about it. So I decided. So I went home that night. I modulated Street's aria from F minor to C minor, and there it was. Now it's a tenor part, So I made him a tenor, and Tom just embodied it, took it all kinds of places. I mean, and also he had the liberty to improvise. He was an improviser. He could scat. When he sings "Play the Game," he doesn't do it strictly the way that he plays around it. And it was great because there's this incredible energy about it. And every performance was a little different. The way I wrote the part, because I was thinking kind of the jump blues stuff like Louis Jordan, and the Timpani Five and stuff like that, or Nat King Cole in the 1940s, late 1940s, so that kind of jazz, rhythm, and blues combination, that thing. And then Cab Calloway, of course, too. But trying to capture that and to give him the freedom also to make it his. And we talked about, I say, he didn't have to be literal with the music. Sometimes he could do things differently. And then when I did this new version now, I listened to Tom's version and I said, oh, I like that so much better than when I wrote it. What I wrote was too square. So I started writing some embellishments of it with this idea of, how it could be more expansive and stuff. And Victor's taken it, and now he does his own thing to it too.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in order to do right by what you wrote with this, I'm thinking, yeah, this is an opera that should be done all over the place. Why isn't this done all over the place? Why isn't this like the big opera? I think, now people are starting to wake up to this. But I think part of it is you have to really be bi-musical, in some senses tri-musical, not just the players in the pit, but also the singers.
Right. Well, one of the advantages of working with black singers is that they have many experiences. They sing in church. Maybe they sing in the black church. They sing opera, but some of them have sung jazz too. It's not an alien art form.
Right.
So, and then you can find the hybrid musician, the musician who, and I think that's merged over time. It was rarer in 1986 when I did than it is now, because they're exposed to many things. I think an opera program, my wife might disagree because she's an opera singer, but I think they have to learn Billie Holiday. They have to understand Billie Holiday, because to understand how you use words and how you phrase and how you find rubato within time, how you find freedom within the time, rather than, having to stop the time.
I agree with that completely. There's a phrase that I wrote here that I was thinking about describing what it is, that in order to do right by a piece like this, you need to have what I call a desegregated music culture, where it's open. And it's interesting because on the one hand, there are still these folks now, although their voices are getting more and more muffled, who want to preserve the Western classical tradition, keep all this other stuff out. But then at the same time, it's interesting that this all came together in an opera about Malcolm X and about the Nation of Islam, which was about kind of trying to separate these strands. Elijah Muhammad probably wouldn't have approved of all the different kinds of music that was.
No, because they're puritanical.
Yeah.
There's a puritanical street music in America anyway. But I think Malcolm had reached a point with his movement when he formed his own movement, left the Nation of Islam. He realized that the potential of seeing a broader idea, a desegregated world. But he realized something that the civil rights struggle was really about power and really about economics. And also that self-determination has to be part of that in order for black businesses to thrive. The struggle will only be successful if we uplift ourselves. And we can't rely on the white world to help us, And I think, in a way, they kind of worked together, Martin Luther King and Malcolm at the time. So it's interesting to me. When I wrote X, I wanted to have the freedom to assume that there was no boundary in genre, that one can explore and go across cultural and genre boundaries to make something new.
Yeah, and by that point, jazz immersed in classical music, immersed in traditional gamelan music, there were all these different things that were in your head that you couldn't unhear.
It was important to me that the music could reflect that broader sense. Sometimes they call it eclecticism, which I think is a bad word for it, because that's like thinking you're picking pebbles on a beach or something. It's actually a resolution of identity, of discovering who you are as a composer and as a person, and how that is reflected in the music you make. Part of it is your education and musical education, what you're exposed to, and to me, all that stuff recalls emotional states, experiences in terms of what the music implies, And I think what that can relate to is subtext in a dramatic sense. What is the subtext of what's going on? And so the music always provides a subtext.
Let's listen to a little bit of one of Anthony Davis's other operas, Amistad, which also has a libretto by Thulani Davis. Here's part of Act 2, Scene 7's chorus, Nancy Brer Nancy, from the recording released on New World Records. I think what you said earlier on in the conversation, reading Nietzsche and thinking about, opera and how it relates, that these dualities refer more to Americans than they do to Europeans in a way, because
Right.
we are a hybrid culture.
Since the minstrel show, they haven't been a European culture. I mean, since 1840. So that struggle is over. Also, the Europeans' vantage point on quote-unquote vernacular music, which is a funny word, but I don't think they have the love and appreciation of what that is. And it doesn't define them the way it defines us. They have a love for the music, so many fans of Ellington, et cetera, but I think that it doesn't define them in the same way. So it's important to me to bring that into it, the equation. I mean, I didn't have to leave my traditions and leave what I love in music to be an opera composer. I brought that with me. You don't leave stuff behind. You don't do that.
Right. Now, the other thing that we didn't get into yet that made X such a revolutionary piece is, people talk about this very odd term, CNN opera. That operas that are about contemporary figures, current events. Yours was the first. X predates Nixon in China. It predates, all these other things that have kind of become part and parcel of what creating a contemporary opera that speaks to contemporary audiences are about.
Well, yeah, it was kind of a pejorative the way it was used to CNN operas. It was kind of to dismiss this trend. If we're just borrowing, it's about the headlines, et cetera. Rather than finding, like in Malcolm, I found a tragic hero. You can relate it directly to Birth of Tragedy. What is a tragic hero? He even gave me 3 different names. So each act could be a change of name. This person who went through the fire, went through this whole odyssey and transformation, and then when he finally has a realization of who he is and what he can do in the world, he's struck down by his own people. That's something that's really always got me. I mean, it wasn't like some crazy white dude with Martin Luther King, so to me that makes it tragic outcome. And then his legacy, Malcolm's such an identifiable figure, not just in the U.S., but in the West Indies, in South America, and Africa, how rappers are inspired by Malcolm X, etc. He's a transcendent figure. I think that's the reason to do this. It's not just to capture some moment in history or some voyeuristic kind of thing to looking at history. It's not about that. It's about how those stories resonate now, what they say to us, and what his story tells us about who we are now.
But, similarly, other operas of yours have mined recent history. You have a whole opera about Patty Hearst, Tanya, and obviously, the most recent Central Park Five, which is something that's very much on our minds because the former president of the United States, way before he was, kind of began his career as this demagogue.
Right, exactly.
Through Central Park Five, he's a minor character in that opera. So, these are very much about characters that we know that, in a way, the early operas were about myths, but these are the myths of our time. We may all know who Malcolm X is, but do we know who the real Malcolm X was? So he's sort of been mythified.
Oh, of course.
And certainly, Patty Hearst has been mythified in our culture. And, the Central Park Five, this is still an unresolved story, for some people. These people, were jailed for years and they finally been exonerated and finally got reparations for it. But you still have people out there in the woodwork, including that former president.
Of course, yeah.
Insists that they're guilty.
Yeah, with no evidence to say that they were guilty. No physical evidence, nothing. Yeah. Of course, the truth to them doesn't matter.
No.
Because they're only interested in propaganda. They're only interested in what will advance their individual agenda and only interested in power. And that's unfortunate because, right now, it's a really dangerous time in America. We could be on the edge of fascism. And that's something I worry about every day. I did a class this year on 20th century opera, and I was teaching Wozzeck, and I was doing Mahagoni, and I used this book called Opera and Fascism. And it was really interesting, because, what we face now is so much like the 30s in Germany and Berlin, and the present danger of we could actually lose democracy. We could lose what we have. So it made it more urgent for me as an artist, I think, is to start to present things to challenge those forces. I've always felt strong as an artist, but even more now.
Well, certainly when you write a piece on the stage like this, of course, most of the people who are going to attend Central
Yeah.
Park 5 Opera are people who are going to agree, with the truth.
Well, you're preaching to the converted, right?
Yeah.
But it was interesting because Jenny Rivera, who's the general manager at Long Beach, when we did in Long Beach, she said that she had Republicans on her board, and they came to the opera, and they liked it. They were interested in it because also you're trying to reach people at the level of empathy. In the opera, I was trying to get people to, what if I were one of the five or my child was one of the five? What does that mean? Well, how could I relate to that? When you get people to do that, then you might make a little change anyway. I think it's really important to stand up to those forces. I mean, because where I live, California is a safely blue state in many respects, but if you just travel a few miles east of the West Coast, you realize you're in Trump land again. You have to keep on challenging that. Sometimes you can seduce people with art. When I was doing streets music, for example, I wanted to make the music fun so that the audience would imagine, wait a second, I would like to do that. I would do that. Then they'd say, uh-oh, I really would do that. Sometimes you have to go through things to see what the attraction is, what the appeal is, why somebody, and that's something that's really fascinating me all the time, because it's so easy to cancel and condemn things and not go through what the experience is.
Let's listen to Avery Brooks, who plays the Symbionese Liberation Army leader Chinque, sing I'm the Smoke in Your Jumbo Jet in the Patty Hearst-inspired opera Tanya, music by Anthony Davis, libretto by Michael John Lacusa, released on Koch International Classics.
I'm the smoke in your jumbo jet. I'm the bomb at your Super Bowl. I'm the outlawed. I'm the other law. I'm the anger you hunted down, who now hunt you. I'm the anger you captured, you sought and abused. I'm the scream at your bed and the chaos you try to deny. I'm the shadow in your closet, under your pillow in your dark and darkest dreams. I'm the bomb at your Super Bowl. I'm your love and your peace.
When you create an opera, you do create, as you said, this zone of empathy for the characters. So then are there some characters who should be off limits? Like, should there be a Putin opera, let's say?
I'm sure there will be. There'll be a Putin opera, yeah. There was the Stalin opera, so there must be a Putin opera. I think you probably could only do a Hitler one as a comedy.
Yeah,
Springtime for Hitler, that's about it.
There's never been. I need to investigate what this Stalin opera is because I don't know.
Well, no, it was Robert Wilson that did it. Life and Times of
the Life
Joseph
and Times
Stalin.
of, that's right.
I don't know how much it's like about Stalin really, but
yeah. And this idea of Stalin as a Helden tenor. What is it?
Well, funny thing about Trump is because he's such a tenor. It's a tenor voice, and then it was interesting to write him. You could play him as a buffo tenor role, kind of buffo thing, but someone asked me, how do you write music for Trump? And I said, well, first of all, he's a tenor. Second of all, he repeats things a lot. Third thing is he never finishes a sentence. So you have to look at how there's a characteristic about his speech. Why was that appealing to people? That's launched his whole career as a politician. He exploited the racial divide for his own personal benefit as a political figure. What is the lure to it? What is that about? That gets interesting because it's easy to just do it as a comedy. I've been thinking a lot about doing an opera, maybe of The Great Dictator or something. And that's another piece that kind of deals with Hitler and stuff, but it was really interesting. And it supposedly came out of a comment Gershwin made to Charlie Chaplin. They were doing some kind of benefit. They were appalled by what's going on in Hollywood because Germans were raising money in Hollywood. So Gershwin said to Chaplin, allegedly, that Hitler's doing you. He's the little tramp. He's doing you. So why don't you do him?
Wow. Wow.
That could be Putin or Hitler or Trump. But the great dictator would be, I think, might be interesting.
Well, one piece we didn't get to talk about that I'd love to talk about just a little bit because I love it, and it's a piece that I wish would be better known, was your Lear on the Second Floor, which I think is so moving and poignant. Talked about empathy before. I think I've never seen dementia portrayed in an operatic context in a way that's so understanding and empathic and moving. My favorite scene is the scene where this nurse is trying to make her take a bath, and it's this reggae aria that's just fabulous.
Dr. Lear. Knock, knock. Who's there? Your damn shoes. Stop leaving them in the kitchen cupboard. Ridiculous.
Where did all my visitors go?
Girl, you ain't had none in weeks. But let me tell you something. I am here for you. In uniform bleached and starched. I am here for you. To see you through the chilling dark. During your rehab. I'll watch you from dusk till dawn. I will help you to the loneliness.
That was just a tiny portion of Act 1, Scene 4 of Lear on the Second Floor, music by Anthony Davis, libretto by Alan Havis, featuring Jarrell Williams as the nurse for Nora Lear, sung by Susan Naruki, from the University of California telecast of the production.
That was fun to write, and I had a great performance. Jarrell Williams is incredible. And he asked me, can I do it in a Caribbean accent? I said, sure. Oh, my God. Because I wrote it as a reggae. And I was funny because I was thinking about the relationship. So this is an everyday occurrence. This is something that happens with different forms of dementia and stuff. One of the symptoms is actually sexual arousal and taking on other relationships and stuff, promiscuity. Thought about that a little bit. And that's something that no one explores much in this. There's an opera, there's a movie that I saw with Julie Christie that was about Alzheimer's. That's where some of the title comes from, because it was talking about the people on the second floor who are more gone. My wife's aunt had Alzheimer's and died of it, and I had a close friend who had Lewy body disease, who was in San Diego, and so I saw the progression of that. And so that's where the counting comes from, the counting of this thing. And he was a scientist and a brilliant mind and a doctor as well. He could think, but he couldn't talk. He could only sing, which was really weird. Toward the end of his life, he could only sing to communicate. And I thought about that. Also thinking about Shakespeare's Lear and with the relationship with the fool. There's a lot of mysteries in that play. Like there's no Mrs. Lear. So what is the storm? Is the storm just a physical storm, or is it a mental storm? Is it a fugue state? So for me, the storm was about a mental state. And I had done incidental music for a production of King Lear that was at the Yale Rep with Avery Brooks's Lear. And it was based on the idea that it was the Olmec civilization or something. So African meets Mexican. So it's interesting because I wrote incidental music. But I was frustrated with it because when we got to the storm, I had all these ideas for the storm, but the director didn't want me to do it. And because I knew Avery could sing too. Avery, you want to sing this storm? I thought of the storm also being all the voices, all these voices coming all around of the whole play collapsing on him at the same time. So the storm would be this collection of voices rather than, thunder, lightning, all that shit. But the director didn't want to do it. So I was frustrated because I've thought about it. And then I thought, maybe I should do an opera about a King Lear opera. And they said, Verdi tried it, but he couldn't do it. I mean, it's too much. There's too much. But I could do kind of a take on it. And then it turned out my friend Alan Havis, who is a great playwright, he was asked to do a Yiddish Lear for Shelley Berman. So he wrote a play of Lear that was in Yiddish for Shelley Berman, a Yiddish Lear. We were good friends, and so we were talking about it. So we finally got to, we should write a Lear. So what would it be? And I talked to Todd about this Julie Christie movie I saw, that where she has an affair with someone else who's also has Alzheimer's, and she doesn't remember her husband, so she doesn't remember her relationship with her husband, and there's something buried in their relationship that's screwed up. Okay, so I saw it using that, and so why don't we call it Lear on the Second Floor? So here we go, and then we took off from there. It's like, and then the fool became her dead husband, and it was an interesting, different take on it. And I think Alan was really brilliant with that, because as I said, we both have worked on Lears.
I thought it was very, very moving. And
thank you.
Thank you. And it's
Eastman School of Music is doing a production of it in November.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great. So these pieces are starting to enter the repertoire. This is exciting. Yeah. And this is sort of the final area I wanted to speak to. You're thinking about what the next project is, because composing music, creating music is very much about the present. But now, that this older piece that's, X is more than 35 years old at this point, now it's getting done again. It's part of history. All these pieces of new music are going to become old music. They're going to be the past. What's your hope for this body of work?
I thought, when during COVID hit, I didn't have any commissions. My commissions were canceled. All stuff's canceled. I was doing a few telemetic concerts, but not that much. So I thought, what am I going to do? And I said, well, Excite was a score I'd done by hand before computers. And then Shermer had done parts, and it was done in score, I think, or something. So I thought, well, I'd like to make the piece so that it could be done by orchestras, as excerpts. I could put narration with it, so I could write some narration. So I started taking excerpts of the opera, and I'd done this concert kind of thing with my group with excerpts, but I thought I'd do it for the largest possible thing: chorus, orchestra, and principals and everything. But an ideal situation with these excerpts. So I started working furiously on these excerpts. Like every day, I worked 4 or 5 hours on it during the COVID thing, because had to have something to do. I just about finished the excerpts, which is a little more than half of the opera, I guess, about an hour and a half of music. And then Yuval called me and said he wanted to do the whole thing. So I said, great, I've done the half, I might as well do the whole thing. So I did the rest. Doing it, I looked at the score and I wanted to make it as clear as possible, clarifying some of the things in the orchestration, and then, maybe I didn't need this repetition, or maybe I didn't need this, making it as synced as it could be, as much more, as powerful as it could be. And revised version of the opera emerged from that. That was really exciting to do. It's like looking at a mirror and seeing, the Dorian Gray thing or something. like you see your 30-year-old self staring back at you. I had to protect that 30-year-old self from my 70-year-old instincts to change everything. But I said, no, I got to be faithful to what I was thinking then. What I was thinking, my musical ideas were at that point.
I'm really impressed that you did that deep dive into the past. I'm also impressed about your optimism for the future, that you were working on this piece, a big piece for chorus and full orchestra in the middle of a pandemic when there couldn't even be such performances.
It gives you a certain kind of freedom because you had no deadline, right? Not even a due date, no deadline. I can really fine-tune this thing and do something, thinking about, what I want this piece can endure and be preserved in the best possible way. And also doing a computer thing would allow me to do, if I wanted to do it with a smaller group, I could adapt it. I could do stuff, So it was something I thought about. And I'm so glad that, I did it. And I was able to, do the whole opera. There's always a fire when you do something for the first time. There's a flame that comes, it's like you're discovering all these things. My first opera, I discovered a ton of things. So it was really rewarding for me to go back and made me understand why I went into opera and why I wanted to continue to do opera and do new. I wrote an aria for a new opera too, so hopefully I can get some of these commissioned.
Is that The Great Dictator, or is this something else entirely?
No, this one is called about the Tulsa Race Massacre, called Fire Across the Tracks, Tulsa, 1921, and Talani was writing a libretto for it. And then I'd done this other opera I had started a while ago called The Reef that was based on Edith Wharton's novel. That's totally different from anything I've ever done because it's, about kind of Gilded Age character study, but I interjected race in it because we put it in a sugar plantation in the West Indies rather than Paris. And one of the characters is mixed race and the chorus is black. It's a different take on Edith Wharton. The race equation wasn't really in her writing that much.
Wow, well, I'm very eager to hear all of this stuff.
Well, thank you, Frank. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And it's great to talk to someone who knows something about what I do.
Thank you. This concludes our episode of Sound Lives, but before we go, let's listen to a little bit more of X. This is the finale of Act 2, which is Malcolm X's response to reporters when asked about the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Elijah Muhammad's reaction to Malcolm's response. Eugene Perry sings Malcolm, and Thomas Young sings Elijah Muhammad. Music by Anthony Davis, libretto by Thulani Davis, from the 1992 Gramavision recording of the opera.
In my view, it's the case of the chickens coming home to roost. Our chickens come home to roost. Now Malcolm is away.
New Music Box is brought to you by New Music USA, the resource for adventurous creators and listeners in the U.S. and beyond. This program is funded in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and listeners like you. If you enjoyed today's episode, visit newmusicusa.org to explore more stories and voices from our new music community.